Welcome, ladies and or gentlemen, back to the channel. I haven't uploaded in a little over a month. I'll get to that a little later in the video. Today we're going to be focusing on drive shafts and driveline vibrations. More specifically, driveline vibrations. I've been tracing down an issue on this car for over 2 years that I just haven't been able to get rid of until now. I replaced literally everything in the driveline at this point. I've replaced both flex discs, I've replaced the center support bearing and carrier, and I also replaced both motor mounts and transmission mount as well. I had what I thought was a torque converter shutter, turned out not to be a torque converter shutter, ended up replacing the torque converter anyways. That's a whole nother story. There's a few other issues I was having with it too, but I finally ended up changing the whole drive shaft because the universal joint was showing signs of going bad, and I'll get onto that later in the video, but it's a long process. I've finally gotten rid of the vibrations, finally. So what we're going to be getting into in this video is specifically how to diagnose driveline vibrations. And the specific components and how they affect vibrations, what type of vibrations you're going to see, and how to remove each one of those components from the car. In order to do that, I need to take off the exhaust. Let me go do that. I will show you guys how to put it back in later in the video. I'm not going to show how to remove it because, well, we're actually in the future and I've already done it. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright guys, I am knee-deep into troubleshooting and repairing a problem I've been having on this car for, God, like over 2 years. Really annoying problem. Not really a huge deal or safety risk, but definitely an annoyance. It's two different types of vibrations. It's a subtle vibration between 30 and 45, light to moderate acceleration, and then an extremely heavy vibration at the same speed under very heavy load. So like flooring it going uphill. It makes the center of this drive shaft here, and actually video footage, I'll play it right now. But you can see that when I accelerate, the center support right here flops all around like crazy. And that feels, honestly, it feels like someone's just whacking the bottom of the car. And it's very violent. This is actually the new drive shaft, obviously used. There's 165,000 trips to the local grocery store here on this drive shaft, or for those of you in Rio Linda, 165,000 miles. This is the original drive shaft, and one interesting thing I'm knowing about this, the new drive shaft, both yokes, hard to see here without light, but the tine of the yoke coming out the bottom and the tine of the yoke coming out the front come out at exactly the same angle. Like this one's going to point straight down. This one down here is also going to point straight down. That is not the case with the old drive shaft. Now I don't know how easy it is for you to see here, but the old drive shaft right here, you can see this side of the drive shaft is sitting flush on the concrete, and this concrete is straight. The other side here is raised up on one end. Now I don't know how much of a difference that actually made, but it seemed on this case to have fixed my problem. The other issue, and the main reason why I bought this drive shaft and why I'm not just replacing parts to see if it fixed the issue, is that this universal joint is actually bad. When it's up in the car and it's sitting at the correct inclination where it's supposed to be, I can grab one of these shafts and twist it, and there's slop in the universal joint. So that's obviously a no-no. And there's also, it's very tight in one direction, and then in the other direction it's notchy. And if you have a notchy drive shaft, it essentially means that it's the universal joint is always spinning at the same inclination. You know, it's not angled off in one direction. It's straight, and that means that the roller bearings essentially wear into the shaft in the universal joint, in the trunnion, and that is a surefire way to get some vibrations in your driveline as well. So I went ahead and replaced the whole thing, and that definitely seemed to have worked. Now I will show you how to replace a drive shaft. It's very simple, but that's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is for me to show you how to diagnose a driveline without having to just replace all of the components and hope that one of them fixes it. Now there's one type of vibration that feels very similar to a driveline vibration that doesn't actually have to do, well, not technically with the driveline, and that is a torque converter shutter. Now a torque converter shutter is not very common on a Mercedes. I actually had the torque converter fail on this car. I have a video series on rebuilding the transmission. And the torque converter on this car was it was basically slipping under heavy acceleration, and it was slipping when the lockup clutch would try to engage. That was a relatively easy repair, obviously minus dropping the entire transmission to get to it. But anyways, a shutter in the torque converter is more RPM dependent than it is speed dependent. And the reason for that is because it's coupled directly to the engine, not directly to the output shaft of the transmission. So whereas you would have, maybe 3,000 RPMs going into the transmission, you'll have at low speed maybe only 1,000 RPMs coming out of the transmission. So whereas an RPM dependent shutter would cause you to notice it more when just you kind of blipping the throttle pedal, a driveline vibration will show up consistently at the same speeds, no matter what RPM your engine is at. Because I could reproduce this problem every single time, no matter if I'm at 1,000 RPMs or 3,500. It would do it every single time. And in order to know what I'm talking about, you'd really kind of have to feel it in your feet or in your butt. Now, a driveline vibration coming back from the drive shaft here, you're going to notice that feeling more in your butt. You're going to notice it more, if you rest your elbow on the center console, you're going to feel it there. Because it's really coming from under and behind the driver's seat. Now, a torque converter shutter, you're going to feel that more in your feet, because your feet, kind of hard to see without light, but your feet are right here. I mean, your feet are right here, and the torque converter is right there. You're going to feel that more in your feet. You will feel it a little bit in your butt, but not as strongly as you would in the driveline vibrations. Now, the first thing I actually recommend replacing, and it's very easy to diagnose to see if it needs to be replaced or not, is the center support bearing and carrier. Now, the bearing carrier, hard to see here, but do you see that crack right there? This is the center support. As I told you, I replaced mine. This is the center support from the used drive shaft I got. And the bearing in this is actually bad. I'm not going to replace it right away. Don't have enough time today. It's not terrible. I'm going to end up swapping the new bearing and carrier from my old drive shaft to the new drive shaft. Ways to tell how this is bad. Number one, the rubber, right? The rubber, you will see cracks along there. You'll see cracks along the top. This one is not terrible, but there is a crack a little bit right there. And then I believe on the back, there's some cracking you can see right in there. Hard to see on camera because it's just close tolerances. But that will absolutely lead to a highway vibration. It's something that you're going to feel more so at high speeds. It could also cause kind of a whacking, a slapping type effect like I was talking about that I had. But the other thing that can go bad is the bearing. Now the bearing is actually what causes a bit more of a catastrophic failure. If the bearing blows up, your drive shaft's not going to fall out of the car, but it will cause a very severe vibration that feels like the car is shaking itself apart. Now the bearing, there is a more involved process in removing the bearing and carrier. I'm going to link a video in the description below on a video done by a YouTuber called Cardiologist. He filmed a really good video on replacing the center support bearing and carrier on these E320 CDIs, and really any W211. It goes for the E55s as well, the E63s. And I don't know if the W212 or 210 uses the same exact system, but they're all pretty darn close. Mercedes has used this type of center support for a very long time. I'm going to link that below. In the meantime, I am going to film how to replace this myself, and then I'll upload that video as well. But that is for the future. Now, how do you tell that the bearing's bad? That's a good question, Mr. Freak. Now, the easiest way to tell whether the bearing's bad is actually to remove the flex discs. So you remove the flex discs on both sides and leave the center support in place. You also want to make sure that you're putting the center piloting shaft and bushing back where they belong in the drive shaft. You want to make sure that that shaft and pilot bushing are in on both sides, and what that will allow you to do is freely rotate the entire drive shaft in a circle, but without any of the load from the differential or transmission. That'll allow you to, grab a hold of this flange and whip it really quick. And if you're hearing kind of a whining or a grinding noise that sounds like this, then that means that your bearing is definitely bad. All right, and the second things to look at is your flex discs. Now, these flex discs can be very troublesome, and how they work is quite confusing to some people. You're going to get cracks that form in here. And the reason for that is the power that's transferred from the output shaft of the transmission to the drive shaft, or from the drive shaft to the differential, is not transferred through this area. That torque is transferred through this area here. This is the thickest part of the flex disc, and it's the part that has all of the super important, the most amount of support inside the rubber. There's actually a cording, like a tire has cording on the inside that allows the rubber to move and flex and absorb vibration, but not so far that it breaks or rips. So what you need to do is look in here, but most of all in this thicker area right there, because that is the area where cracks forming will cause a serious vibration. And you'll see it forming as well around, like this area here, around where your bolts go through here. You might notice a little bit down the center of that relief. But flex discs generally are not going to cause a minor vibration. They're going to cause a serious vibration, especially under load. Huge thing when it comes to driveline vibrations that you need to look at as well is not only your motor mounts up there, but also the transmission mount. Now this transmission mount is bolting directly down to this cross member here and then into a support piece that goes back to the transmission right there. Now the rubber inside there can collapse, and what that essentially does is it not just allows the transmission to tip side to side like it's supposed to under load, but it allows the transmission to raise up or down, or causes the transmission under low load to sit down lower than what it's supposed to be, and that causes an inclination problem in the drive shaft. Inclination is essentially the angle of operation, and when that angle of operation is thrown out of whack, it causes the drive shaft to vibrate, of course. So what you need to look out for here, and it's hard to see, but you need to look inside there at the rubber. Don't be afraid, it's only 4 bolts. You've got 2 16mm bolts there, 2 13mm bolts on the bottom right there, and then just remove that transmission mount. Make sure to obviously support the transmission or else it's going to fall down. Remove that and look at the rubber on the inside. Make sure it's not cracked, make sure it's not deteriorated, and if this metal part in the center just falls out, well, then you got to get a new one. Essentially what you're trying to prevent with mounts is you're trying to make sure that the transmission and the engine, for the most part, sits exactly where it should from the factory, allowing the drive shaft to sit exactly where it should from the factory. Now, another thing to look out for here, which is actually not very common, is this this cross member right here that the mount bolts to. Now, it should look like this. Completely flat on the bottom, the same angles on both sides. It should basically mirror itself in the center on both sides. This car did not come with a center support looking like that. Essentially, something came along on the front side here and pulled this whole thing down. It essentially pulled this down, and it was such a clean bend that it actually, to me, looked like it was factory. Something came along here, most likely a log or something that the previous owner hit, and bent this thing down. Now essentially what that did is it caused the transmission and the engine to sit down about 3/4 of an inch lower than what it's supposed to be. Now, as I suggested earlier, that's going to cause the drive shaft to sit lower than what it should. So essentially my driveline problems were not just one issue. I had the inclination of the drive shaft out of whack. I had the universal joint bad right here. I had a bad center support and carrier. Now, of course, this car has, in excess of 460,000 miles on it, and so did the drive shaft. The drive shaft was original. So you're obviously not going to have that many issues on your driveline as I did trying to seek perfection here. But it is a good idea to get under here, look at the components. If you've got a vibration, try and narrow it down to, a single component, and find out what exactly is causing the problem and get it fixed. Now, for removing the drive shaft, I'm not going to show you on camera me physically removing the drive shaft from the car, because I've already done it multiple times in trying to diagnose this problem, at least twice in the last couple days, and frankly I have no desire to do it again. But what I will do is show you step by step every tool that's required and every step that's required in order to remove the drive shaft. And we'll start here at the flex disc. Now, the flex disc is held in with a series of bolts. They're all the same length bolts, but they do go in differently, and the position of the nuts and the washers on the bolts is critical to make sure that it's going back together correctly. Now, you're going to need a T60 here, and you're also going to need an 18mm wrench for the other end. Wrong end. you're going to need this end, because you cannot fit a box end back here. There's just not enough room behind by the differential. So box end wrench, T60, and a tool that helps doing this better than anything else, saves your arms, makes the job so much faster, is one of these babies, impact wrench. Now this is just one of those cheapo Harbor Freight 3/8 impact wrenches here, but this thing has saved me so much time in working on cars, and it makes it so easy to remove these things. I'll take one off here and show you how it's done. It's that simple. It's so much easier to use an impact trying to take these flex discs off, as well as putting them back on. Done. Now you'll see a difference here on how these bolts go through versus where the heads touch the rubber, giggity, and where the heads touch the flange here. So on the sides where you have the bolt going straight through the flange, you're not going to have a washer underneath the head. The washer is going to go on the rubber side. Same here on this one, the washer is underneath the head on the rubber side and not on the flange side where the nut is on the other side. So basically the general rule here is make sure you always have a washer going over top of the flex disc here where the bolt goes through. Now in the flex disc in here, you have a series of metal tubes that are actually molded directly into the rubber that protrude from the flex disc to the side that it's going to mate with the flange. So like this one right here, for instance, you're going to have a metal tube coming out of here that sticks slightly out of this side going into the flange. In order to pop those out, you can either whack the edge of the rubber right here with a hammer. That usually will knock loose the tube from the inside of the flange. Or you can stick a punch, once the bolts have been removed, stick a punch on the inside and then whack that tube out of the flange. You're going to have to do the same thing on both the differential side as well as the transmission side. Now, to remove the transmission side is you need to remove the cross member mount as well as the transmission offset mount that's back here. In order to do that, you're going to need a 16mm socket and a 13mm socket with various extensions, 3/8, ½ inch, whatever you want to use. You've got 3 13mm bolts back here, 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 and then same on the other side as well. That will separate the transmission offset from the transmission, and then you have 6 16mm bolts coming in under here on the crossmember side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over there. Pop those out, and then you can leave the mount attached to the crossmember and leave the offset mount attached to the mount here. Pull this all out as one unit only after you have supported the bottom of the transmission. Please don't forget, support the bottom of the transmission with a jack, and then make sure you put a 2x4 or 2x6 underneath the pan to distribute pressure and make sure you're not pushing too much in one location. Once that's done, the only thing preventing you from removing the drive shaft is the center support. Now you have 2 bolts holding up the center support. Both of them are external Torx E12s, or if you don't have a dedicated Torx socket, a 3/8 12-point will also work to remove these, or the equivalent of a 3/8 in those Access Anywhere sockets. Once those 2 bolts are removed, make sure you're supporting the drive shaft because the center is going to want to come out. In order to remove the drive shaft, the easiest way, as well as the easiest way to actually remove the flex discs, popping the flex discs off of the flanges is one thing, but actually removing them from the area where they sit over there is a whole nother story. And if you're going to plan on replacing your flex discs, I definitely recommend dropping the drive shaft in the process and replacing the center support as well with it. Make it all one job. It's one of those do it while you're in there type jobs. And once that drops down, the U-joint is going to flex. Let the U-joint flex and then take both sides of the drive shaft and push them in together. There's splines in here. It'll allow you to push it and shorten the drive shaft and then pop it out of each one of those flex discs on either side, and then the whole drive shaft will pop down. Now putting the drive shaft back in is the exact same process in reverse. Put the drive shaft back into the pilot holes on either end of the drive shaft. You're going to want to put the pilot holes back in the pilot bushings on the differential and the transmission. When you put the center support bolts back in, push this all the way in one direction or the other, what that will do is it'll kind of pull out the rubber. It'll stress the rubber, allowing this to center better, as well as put a little bit of load on the bearing. What that does is it gives the rubber in here, which is actually fairly flimsy, even on new center supports, gives it a little bit more strength and support to keep the drive shaft from flopping around in there. Then you can tighten down those two E12s. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned and is somewhat of a subject of controversy, you can do it if you want, you don't have to, is marking the position of the yoke here in relation to the yoke on the other end. So the two yokes on the differential end and the two yokes on the transmission end. And the reason why I say that's controversial is I really don't think it matters. Both the yokes on both sides are machined. They are forged or cast and then machined and precision ground on both ends, both flanges here, both flanges on the other side. And the reason why that matters is that means they're balanced. These flanges are already balanced. And the idea that you need to make both the flanges line up with each other in degrees of rotation doesn't really make much sense to me, because if you're going to replace the drive shaft, that balancing is lost and it no longer matters. And I have no vibration with this new drive shaft in place. So, I mean, like I said, it doesn't make much sense, number one. Number two, these are already balanced by way of machining. One thing that absolutely does matter and is critical is both halves of these drive shafts are balanced to each other. So it's put in and balanced as one unit, and they will actually separate, being that they're two pieces, here at the spline. Now, the male splines are attached to the universal joint end. Female splines are attached to the output shaft of the transmission side of the drive shaft. There are marks on the drive shaft itself that show you where these are supposed to go in. Let me find it here for you. You'll see right there that little notch on one end is going to line up with those two notches right there on the universal joint. When those two notches line up, your drive shaft is put back the correct way. Now, a lot of people will still take a Sharpie and they'll mark each end of the half to make sure that it goes back together correctly. That's fine if you want to do it, but it's absolutely not necessary. Now, the last thing that makes accessing everything I've just shown you so much easier and arguably even possible at all is removing the exhaust, which you can see I've actually already done. There's no exhaust on the car. And the reason for that is the exhaust goes right in here all the way along and prevents the drive shaft from even being able to be dropped down to remove from the car, yet alone access any of the flex disc bolts. So I'm going to show you the easiest way to remove the exhaust and put it back in. Now, I've already removed the exhaust, so I'm going to show you the reverse order how to put it back in, but it's the same exact process whether you're putting it in or taking it out, so giggity. Now, you will notice that there is a band clamp that goes around here when the exhaust is put back on, and that band clamp will slide over the flange on this end as well as the flange on the catalytic converter side and tighten back down. Now, the bolt that goes in here will likely be incredibly rusted, very rusted. And if you're going to remove the exhaust from your car, I would highly recommend spending a couple days actually and just spraying that with penetrant, heating it up, spraying it with penetrant, doing that multiple times to hopefully get that nut loose. Mine didn't break, but what actually happened was the square end that inserts into here, it's sort of a form of carriage bolt, and the square end that went in here started twisting, and it started to splay this part outwards. Now I'm going to have to fix that. It's not too big of a deal, but it's just one of those big pains in the butts that you just don't want to deal with. So highly recommend freeing that nut up on the bolt as much as possible before you try and attempt to take this off. So I'll just go along here and show you what's holding this exhaust up. You've obviously got the clamp over here. You've got this bracket right here. Pay no attention to the bungee cord. That is part of the removal and assembly process I'll show you later. This bracket has two bolts right here, both 13 millimeters, that bolt up to the bottom of the transmission mount. Those are very easy to get to, very easy to remove. Moving back here, these are very easy to miss right here. These babies come in and they bolt in underneath the car with two 13 millimeter nuts. Studs are attached to that and they go in on the car right here. They're right in front of the rear suspension, right there on both sides. Now the last one to remove is right here. Now this one arguably I think is probably the hardest to get to. If you have an air ratchet, it makes it a whole lot easier to remove in a timely manner. Now right in front of the rear bumper, you've got two studs right there. Those studs are where that bracket on the back of the exhaust comes up and slaps over. You've got two on either side. And when the mufflers are back in here, they're slightly in the way of getting those nuts back on there. And swinging a ratchet in there, definitely doable, but it's time consuming. So I found that an air ratchet is the single best thing going for getting those nuts back in there. So I'm going to go ahead and show you putting this back up on camera, and then this job will be done. Now, removing and installing the exhaust is really a two-person job, but if you're like me and you don't always have access to a second person, I found a way around that to do it by yourself. Now, the front of the exhaust is obviously it's the lightest weight because there's no mufflers attached to it. So I found that if you raise the front end of the exhaust first, kind of near where it needs to go, it will help a lot. I use a bungee cord here. Rope will also work. A bunch of strands of twine would work. But you basically want to go from that bracket inside there to there is a hole right in there next to the exhaust. Find an area to tie it up and step back to the back. So what we're going to do here is we're going to raise the muffler end of the exhaust up and into where it goes here. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, just because I said that this is possible to do yourself does not mean I said it was easy. This is not an easy job. Damn it, that's tough. The easiest way to get the rear up, and I use easy very lightheartedly. I'm all of a couple 100 pounds, fairly muscular, and this is not easy, guys. I'm using Romex here. I would highly advise against using Romex and use another human being. This is a tough job. I have Romex going over the top of the rear subframe here, under, and into this cross member here that goes between the exhausts that tie them together. And once you get it up, kind of close to the top, the issue is these things here rub on the edge of the bumper, and you need to kind of pry away the edge of the bumper in order to get that to fit. Now, it doesn't look obvious on this side, but it will over here. As you can see, that's considerably far away from the edge, and we need to squeeze the mufflers back up underneath the bumper. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, once you kind of carefully squeeze the mufflers back under the bumper, or inside the bumper, I should say, make sure that you get, hard to see here, don't have a light, but those rear brackets that we talked about, make sure those are sitting over top of the studs, and then before you do anything else in the exhaust, make sure that those nuts go back on, just loosely for now. Judging from the weight of the rear end of this exhaust, I think the active ingredient in mufflers that makes them function is concrete. Now, making sure that we have the nuts put back on the furthest rear brackets in the exhaust, we can go ahead and take the front end and put it right back up where it needs to go here. Now make sure that the bracket right behind here that goes up to the transmission cross member, you're going to have to fiddle around with that just a wee bit in order to get everything to go back up in here, but this will go back up and slide into place just like that. Now this band clamp needs to be separated slightly and then put right back on there. Just like that. All right, with the band clamp and bolt back in place, I've put a pretty liberal amount of copper schmoo on the bolt here to make sure that this thing does not stick as much as it did before. All right, the band clamp is I forgot the washer. You know, I've generally been a big fan of German engineering, but when it comes to not using stainless on exhaust bolts, I'm really, I don't know why they wouldn't. I mean, they go through the trouble of using stainless in the entire rest of the exhaust for the tubing, for everything else, but they can't use it for the bolts? Why? Am I just missing the metallurgy or something? I mean, what am I missing here? Why can't they use stainless bolts on the exhaust? Now, I'm not going to tighten this the rest of the way until the entire rest of the exhaust is bolted up where it needs to be. So we have the bracket that goes over to the transmission mount, and then we have the brackets in the middle that go right in front of the rear suspension to put back in. Let's go ahead and do that. The product I'm putting on here is called Fluid Film. It's a great rust preventative and lubrication type product. When it dries, it forms kind of a thick wax, but it never really hardens. It always stays kind of gummy, and it's perfect for rust prevention and for anti-seize on fasteners that don't get super hot. It is very hard for me to show you getting these bolts back up in here. There's just no room for a camera, but I'm using an air ratchet with a 13 millimeter short socket just to put these back on here. Now all that's left is to connect the bracket which supports the exhaust from the transmission mount. I've already put the two bolts in. They are 13 millimeter. Go ahead and tighten them down. I almost forgot, do not forget to tighten this band clamp back down. After everything else is straight in the exhaust, we can go ahead and tighten this the rest of the way. The reason we don't tighten it all the way to begin with is because it's going to kind of tweak up and down, side to side, when all of the other brackets are back in place as well. So we want to wait until after the exhaust is totally settled out before we go ahead and tighten this. And that is it, guys. We are done putting the exhaust back in, drive shaft, everything is back in where it needs to go. So I mentioned earlier in the video that I have not been uploading very much as of recently. Like, I haven't uploaded anything in a little over a month. And the reason for that is I've got 5 cars, and I have not had a single issue with any of them in quite a while. It's kind of hard to have a YouTube channel that's focused around, repairing cars, or specifically Mercedes diesels, when they don't break. And so this is just one problem that I didn't really have to tackle right now. It's just kind of an annoyance, and I decided to do it specifically for content purposes. But you guys let me know if you want to see any other type of content. You want to see reviews of any of these cars, if you want to see like some driving videos, let me know. I'm definitely open to making some more content if you guys want to see it. I'm obviously going to keep doing repair videos whenever these cars need to be worked on. That's the main point of this channel. But I'm definitely open to taking a few more routes if you guys want to see that type of content. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Stay tuned till next time.